that is thank these wonderful people that are providing the service. So we have Kathy Hadley, Janine Call, and Josie Nielsen. So please, thank you for the service. Now back to Katie.
Hi, welcome back, everyone. So now we are going to dive into the front lines and what cities are dealing with, people who have to deal with the political heat of this conversation. And so I just wanted to open up with a very general question to react to the last conversation. This conversation about how to properly tackle growth with grace, but also dealing with some really difficult issues like NIMBYism and housing affordability. And Cameron, you've got a tough job bringing together cities across the state to decide how to tackle these types of issues. So very generally, what's your reaction to the conversation ahead of us?
Yeah, thank you, Katie, and thank you to the panel that kicked off our discussion today. First, I think it's important to highlight how Utah is not like California. And there were several conversations that happened over the last hour, but I think we need to add some facts about what's actually been happening on the ground in the last few years here in Utah. So for example, 4 years ago, Utah's housing gap was approximately 56,000 units. And the housing gap was defined as the shortage of new housing units compared to new households formed. So if your kids got married, they created a new household, was there enough new housing to support all those new households? And Utah about 4 years ago had a housing shortage of about 56,000 units. As of July of this year, that number shrunk to about 31,000 units. So we've been trending in a positive direction, and that is in large part due to the collaboration between local city leaders who are planning for growth in responsible ways, and how the private sector has responded to those local plans. And I'm going to give some specific examples therein. Now, the housing gap is not unique to Utah. It's happening all over the country. But Utah is one of the few states where you're seeing that housing gap actually shrink. Now, that's just based on building permits. That doesn't include the tens of thousands of units that cities have already entitled. In fact, I'm looking at Grantsville, and we were having this conversation just a few weeks ago. Remind me the number in Grantsville? So in Grantsville alone, they have 3,000 entitled units for which permits have not yet been pulled. And when you look at those numbers across not just the Wasatch Front, but in Washington County and elsewhere, you're seeing that cities are planning proactively for a lot of housing and a lot of housing types. So there was discussion about density, the four-letter word of density. Well, again, in these last few years, we've actually seen a record amount of new housing density. This year, we are ahead of last year's record-setting pace for townhomes, condos, duplexes, and apartment buildings. And in fact, over the last 4 years, we've seen more multifamily housing permitted than single-family housing permitted across the state. And in another fantastic data point from just a couple months ago, when the Gardner Policy Institute released this data, was that townhomes, duplexes, condos, and apartments made up a greater share of the new housing stock than any time in state history. Now, this is not what was happening naturally in California or in other high-growth states, but it has been happening here. And that is because there's been a collective effort with state leaders, local leaders, private sectors, and others to think ahead of how we plan for growth. And a lot of that comes back to centers. So yes, Ted, I'm stealing your thunder momentarily, because the earlier panel also talked about infill and really challenged cities to get aboard the infill bandwagon. And again, good news is we're not California. It's already happening organically. In fact, I'm sitting next to Nicole from West Valley City. Fairborn Station was one of the first large-scale infill development proposals. Mill Creek Common, I was just chatting with Mayor Silvestrini, who's currently the league president, and Mill Creek Common, they have taken an old underperforming retail center and have created a plan for it that includes a fantastic public amenity and a gathering place, a sense of place for community residents that have ice skating, roller skating, and food trucks and everything that comes with that sense of place. right now has 1,000 units under construction, and come full build out, we'll have 4,000 to 6,000 units of construction on an old retail center. But retail looks a little different in Utah than it does in California as well, because of the fact that we are essentially adding a new Murray city to the state of Utah every year. We're actually seeing really robust retail growth. In fact, the retail vacancy in Salt Lake County right now is 3.66%, which is lower than it was last year at this time, which was 4.14%. So the reason I bring up these facts and these concepts is it's important, based on the discussion from the last panel, to fill in with some Utah-specific information. One of the panelists referenced in California that cities chase retail because sales tax is the primary way to finance cities. Well, historically, there was competition between cities amongst retail. That had lessened considerably in recent years, but the league worked on a bill last year with legislative leadership that actually changes now how we do retail incentives in this state. But one of the ways that cities can still do retail incentives is for mixed-use development that has housing as part of it. So again, they talked about ADUs, we talked about this, and the last piece I'll bring up is station area plans. The panel talked about the need to plan around transit. Well, again, check the box. We're doing that in Utah. That is a difference in Utah compared to California, because House Bill 462, a bill that the league proactively supported, requires local governments to plan in a half-mile radius around transit and meet housing needs as well as other needs around that transit infrastructure. It's really act locally but think regionally with those transit assets. So I think my summary from listening to that last panel is that there's a lot of good happening on the ground in Utah because of city leaders, and we are positioning ourselves well for the future. The biggest difference between California and here is the fact that we are already at the local level proactively leading out on these issues, whereas a lot of our city counterparts in California were not. And because we've been facing the fact that we're the fastest growing state in the country for the last decade, we've had to plan proactively because we are adding a city the size of Murray every year, which means millions of gallons of water per day. It means 62 police officers and 54 firefighters on average for that sort of population growth annually, let alone the 160 miles of roads and all the pipes in the ground and everything that comes with that growth. So we've had to plan proactively. We're doing that planning proactively. And in that case, we are in a much better position to talk about it.
Thanks, Cameron. From the Utah League of Cities and Towns, sorry, I forgot to have you introduce yourself. Nicole, could you also start by introducing yourself?
Yes, and I think we better not turn this off and on. I'm afraid I'm going to be in trouble if we do that. Nicole Cottle with West Valley City. I've been at West Valley City for 25 years, and land use has been a predominant part of my life for those almost 25 years. I am about 96 hours off of a trip to San Francisco. So today you're gonna maybe get a little bit of dramatic, Nicole, because the experience is still very fresh. And if you haven't been to San Francisco over my career, 25-year career, about every 5 years I've had occasion to travel for business, to watch and to it's mostly for bond purposes, bond rating trips and whatnot. So we go for 2 or 3 days at a time. This last was actually a convention. So I've had the good opportunity about every 5 years to be in that city. And I'll start off by saying this last time, 2 things. I was thankful that I had 2 coworkers with me, because if I did not, I would not have left my hotel. That's the first thing I would say. The second thing is, if I were there by myself, there's a strong likelihood that I would have just booked a flight home, because the city has changed. And if you haven't been there, if you haven't had the occasion to be there in the last year or 2, I would submit, maybe 3, I would encourage you to give that a whirl and to take a look, because it was post-apocalyptic is what it felt like. And again, I do have a dramatic flair, as many of you know, but I'm not really exaggerating. It was quite an eye-opening experience for me, and really a sad experience, because I've seen that city at its finest, and it's a beautiful city, as you know. Many of the things we talked about here today, great infrastructure, beautiful buildings, lots of opportunity, and things that are great about that city. I will tell you that it is different, and it's worth a visit, even if it's just a day trip.
Some examples, Nicole?
Yes, absolutely. I never felt safe from the minute I landed in my hotel room, and there were signs of lacking in safety all around, and many people warning of that. And I'm not I might be small. I'm vertically challenged. I'll admit that as well. Dramatic flair and vertically challenged. I don't mind sharing that with you, my friends. But I don't walk around in fear generally, but it was not a safe feeling from the beginning. We encountered many, as we walked the streets for the first day. We decided after that we would Uber around, looking for places to eat after the conference or in the middle of the day. Many places that were completely shuttered. In fact, most streets had the vast majority of their single level, base level retail and eating establishments were totally shuttered. We encountered many locations where human feces were just right out on the middle of the sidewalks. The general smell of the city is rough, and what you see is that it feels like most people have either not come back to the city, or it doesn't feel like the city of 5 years ago, where on the sidewalks, which, as you know, in San Francisco, the sidewalks are pretty broad. You typically during the day and even in the early evening hours couldn't walk because of so many people on the city streets. It was desolate and very shocking. Like I would say, I left feeling shocked, and I was grateful to come home to Utah, and even more grateful for events like this, where we do have the opportunity as Cameron here, and aren't we so lucky to have him as a brain trust on this, that we as a city, as a state, together as Utah, we are trying to handle our business here. We are trying to do that together in partnership with our development partners, our state legislature, our local partners, and trying to help our citizens and residents understand what the potential is if we don't get this right. And so I also left San Francisco proud of what we've accomplished here already in Utah, and proud of the opportunities we have to continue to have these conversations, even though they're hard, and they are hard. Even though as a local government official and someone who helps elected officials navigate through this with regards to the constituencies they face on a daily basis at the gas station and grocery store and church. These are hard topics, but people want to get it right, and I believe that our local elected officials want to get it right and are striving to do that. And I am more thankful today than ever that is occurring, because what I experienced less than 96 hours ago is shocking enough to say to you, you ought to plan a day trip and go check it out. And let's do growth gracefully. I love that term. I'm going to use that. And just so great to have you all here today. And this is one of the great times that we can get together and talk about this. And I appreciate it very much.
Thanks, Nicole. Ted, introduce yourself.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Ted Knowlton. I am the Deputy Director at Wasatch Front Regional Council. For this conversation, I think it's important to note that I'm a city councilor in my town, which is North Salt Lake City. And on the topic of what we learned from California, I have a little bit of a keen interest in this question. I've been tracking loosely what happens in California planning circles for quite a while. I've done a bit of consulting work, not a lot in California. I've been with a firm that has been based in California, now Placeworks. And so I've really been looking at that experiment. And I think Chris talked about this, that one of the things that's fascinating about California is it's the place where kind of America's urban challenges first get addressed. I think that, Chris, you said that. I've always thought that a core lesson from California is, despite years, decades of tinkering and trying to get more housing built, including a lot of state intervention, frankly, stringent requirements for housing elements, targets set, that a community that is dead set against accommodating housing, they're very resourceful. They can find ways to subvert that. Now, that's the California story. Now, Bill Fulton also talked about, that's not necessarily always the case. Contrast that with what's been happening in Seattle. Seattle, they've been welcoming a lot of housing. The story of what unfolds in Utah is still to be written, and I think that we're in the middle of the book right now. One of the things that I wanted to note is that we can't approach this conversation with communities in a clinical way. We can't go to city councils, planning commissions, residents, and talk about only talk about, here are the congestion benefits, the transit ridership benefits of centers, the air quality benefits, the housing affordability of strong downtowns. I think that the plannerly-like clinical conversation only gets you so far. And it's the values based communication that Alan talked about that is really key. Let me give you one anecdote, and then I will finally relinquish the microphone that I've grown so fond of, apparently. My city, North Salt Lake City, we engaged in a general plan development 10 years ago. We asked residents, what they love, what they don't like, what's missing, and you know what they said? They said, we don't have a heart. There's no heart in our community. We don't have a town center. We have no place that gives us an identity. Well, that became the core piece of our general plan, and I will tell you from years on the Planning Commission and now in City Council that has been super easy politically to implement, because people recognize that, look, we're working to create a great place. So the pushback against density hasn't been there in that location. And it hasn't been because we've talked about meeting housing needs. It's been because we've been talking about creating a great place. And one of the massive differences, plainly, between the Wasatch Front and the Bay Area is we are tremendously less dense. And all you have to do is open your eyes when you drive around, or like I did, I got on the train and I took the train down here from the north. This is a sloppy valley. There's a lot of low density, old 0.2 FAR retail. This is a place where there's a lot of communities that are asking themselves, how do we make what we've done in the past better? And if we can tap into great placemaking and that desire, that might be a way that we at least somewhat mollify the NIMBY pushback.
Thanks. Go ahead, Laura. Introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. Excuse me, that was bad timing. My name is Laura Hanson. I work in the governor's office as the state planning coordinator. I've been there just about a year and a half, and the conversation this morning I thought was just fascinating, and I'm going to build on some of the things that my good friends up here have shared. Is that we really need to focus on the hearts and the minds of the public. We have lots of great things happening at the policy level. We have a lot of great thinkers and policymakers and decision makers trying to put policies and plans in place to help us make sure that we're growing in the way that preserves our communities. But none of those are going to be successful if every time you present something in a community, you are met with pitchforks. And so our office is working on a new project that we're calling Guiding Our Growth. And so there's a website, guidingourgrowth.utah.gov. It's just a basic landing page right now, but there's a little survey on there, and I hope you'll all help me promote and share that. But we're working on this with Cameron at the League. We're working with all 7 of the AOGs, the Kempsey Gardner Policy Institute, UDOT, the Salt Lake Chamber, Envision Utah, and the Utah Land Use Institute. and many, many other partners. And our goals with this effort really are to reach the hearts and minds of Utahns. We want to help educate Utahns on growth facts. I have found as we've been traveling around the state that there's a lot of misperception about just the basic facts about growth. In some places, I think people think that we really can just close the doors and just say, okay, no more growth. That's not a reality. We want to try to promote all of the great plans that are in place. We've got station area planning, we've got centers, we've got all of these great tools that are in place to help us direct growth, and I don't think the general public is aware of those or how they work or how they're guiding things. And so I think people are just seeing, gosh, the road around me is getting more congested, and that makes me nervous, and I wish somebody would do something about it. Well, people are, but I think the public's not aware of that. And then, ultimately we want to generate a list of big moves. So strategic investments or policy levers that decision makers can put in place at the state, regional, and local levels to help really guide growth. But I think, one observation that I have found is that growth is really not evenly distributed across the state. We're talking a lot here about how a lot of communities are just bursting at the seams and are ready to just say, okay, no more. But there are a lot of parts around the state that are not growing as fast. In some places we're even losing population. And so as we're having this statewide conversation, we need to recognize that there are differences and nuances from the Wasatch Front to other parts of the state, and maybe there are some ways that we can help bolster growth in the communities where they'd like to see a little bit more growth. They'd like to see more job opportunities, and guide things along here. But as we've been traveling around the state, we've been visiting lots of different communities. We've heard a number of issues that have come up over and over again. Water availability, and to tie that back to the values that Alan and Ted were just talking about, that's health, it's safety, it's security. People are concerned about infrastructure, and that goes to that, travel time. We want to spend more time with our family. They're concerned about housing. They want to be able to have their kids live nearby. Again, reinforcing that family. They're worried about losing their community identity. So they want to have a safe community. They want to know their neighbors. They like the camaraderie of a community where we show up and we help one another. And there's some feeling about a loss of open space and places to recreate with their families, and having crowded areas. I went to Zion National Park recently. It was such a madhouse that we just turned around. We couldn't even find anywhere to park, so we went and hiked somewhere else. So anyways, I will stop there, but I have more to share, but thanks.
Thanks. Yeah, so kind of opening it up, we heard a lot about how, Utah needs to do this, Utah needs to do that in order to, gracefully grow. But you guys are on the front lines, you're dealing with this in the nitty-gritty. Can you talk to us more about what are the biggest obstacles in your way to tackling these types of problems, whether it's housing or, planning communities? Cameron.
The obstacles question really is the multi-billion-dollar question. And yes, that's billion with a B. Because I mentioned in my opening remarks that we are, over the last decade, essentially adding a new city of Murray every year. And many of you know my hometown is Murray, so I love the idea of more Murrays. But what it actually means on the ground is considerable expense and concern at City Hall. When roughly 50 to 55,000 people are joining the state every year, what does that actually mean? I mentioned 62 police officers plus their police vehicles. It's on average 3.3 million gallons of sewage treated per day, 232 new miles of water lines, and 160 new miles of roads. That's on top of all the existing infrastructure that residents are relying on. So it's not just as simple as saying growth should pay for itself, because new residents and old residents will both be using that infrastructure. But that is a refrain we often hear from residents, who are saying we're already paying these taxes for this existing infrastructure. Now we need this new infrastructure to accommodate people. How are we going to make that infrastructure sustainable? Because once it's built, we at City Hall have the responsibility to preserve and maintain it in perpetuity. There's not an off-ramp where West Valley City or North Salt Lake can say, you know what, we're just we're not going to take care of this infrastructure anymore because residents rely on that infrastructure for their basic quality of life. So I think the first big obstacle is infrastructure. The second big obstacle is the hearts and minds piece, and recognizing that Utah is at a crossroads right now. I grew up here, and I remember when my parents built their house in the late 80s in Murray. It was on the west side of Murray. There was no Jordan River Parkway. It was just a bunch of open space around it. Well, needless to say, that open space is gone. Murray's 99+% built out at this point. But there have been some positive and some negative consequences of that. So I mentioned Jordan River Parkway is one. I remember my parents, and this probably won't surprise anybody who knows me, I remember my parents dragging me to a town hall that then Mayor Lynn Pett was holding at Riverview Junior High to talk about the vision for the Jordan River Parkway. My parents wanted to know about it, what the plan was, because we lived fairly close to that area. And prior to the Jordan River Parkway, we recreated there all the time. I'm surprised I'm still alive, and I think about some of the things that I used to do as a kid in that area. But I'm talking about like riding a bike, just to be clear. So we ride our bikes down there all the time and do crazy things. Well, when I asked my dad, who still lives in my childhood home, about the positive changes that he's seen in Murray over the course of living there since the late 80s, the number one thing he brings up is the Jordan River Parkway. That amenity, that heart, right? That heart is what fuels the desire of him to stay there and for people to want to live there. So how do we make sure that as we grow, we have those quality of life amenities? That's what helps gets to the hearts and minds of residents. So when a current Grantsville resident knows that their city is about to double, or in the case of a Saratoga Springs resident that right now has 11,000 housing units built, but 24,000 units entitled, and that population is going to triple or quadruple. How do we make sure that we can still, with a straight face, say to our constituents, you and your kids are going to have the great quality of life that we've always enjoyed, and here's how we plan for that. So there's the nuts and bolts infrastructure piece, but then there's that hearts and minds piece that really comes back to quality of life.
Great. Nicole?
I totally agree with Cameron. I think the other hurdles that we have to face pretty routinely include things like making sure that when we are putting any piece of construction into the ground, that we're recognizing what we're doing is making a generational decision, and making sure that those generational decisions help us maintain balanced and livable and sustainable communities. And West Valley City is a really interesting community. I could show you some of the differences in let's just take housing for a minute, types of housing over different eras, over different generations, and what has happened on the back end of those various types of housing, both construction models and also unit types, and what that has meant for the things that Cameron mentioned. What does that mean for the infrastructure that is there now and that needs to be maintained? What is that type of unit meant for the other nuts and bolts that are required to be provided by your local government, like police and fire services and those other very nitty-gritty, right there at the does my toilet flush or not kind of level, and making sure that is that those types of things are balanced and that your community is sustainable in the long term, I think does require a pretty sizable degree of art and science together to do that. And doing that in what ends up being kind of a complex matrix, while also helping our residents understand how that all fits together and why it is important, is really a very nuanced and challenging thing to do. I do love the things we've talked about today with regards specifically to the values. I think that does get to the hearts and minds of our residents, and when you can back them through that conversation, it's very helpful. But we have many in our jurisdiction that are living exactly what I'm talking about. They fully understand if we don't have a particular unit or unit type that was built in a sustainable way, or that that provides for some of these other things that bring the heart of a community together, trails and park infrastructure and those kinds of things. Some of the early decisions made in our city are make those kinds of nuances glaringly obvious. And so I think the other challenge we face is that, just making sure that we are being very responsible with regards to these generational, multi-generational decisions. Once you put that unit in the ground, it is there. And you heard Clark Ivory mention that. It's there for generations. And doing that right and making sure the lever that gets pulled gives the output that we want on the back end is a challenge.
Ted?
I remember when I moved back to Utah from Portland, and this was right in the middle of the Envision Utah experiment and process. And I came here and I came to work at Envision Utah, and the quality growth strategy, that was the name of that vision, had been minted, and I came to essentially work on the implementation. And even though I grew up in Utah, I didn't know exactly what I would experience working with the communities here. And what I quickly found is that the idea of a walkable center, again, it didn't have to actually be sold or persuaded. People wanted that right up off the bat. Okay, so now here we are. We are in downtown Sandy. It may not feel like downtown Sandy, but there is a desire by Sandy to create a real downtown. And I am not at all intending to disparage what Sandy is doing, because if you look at what Sandy is doing recently, it's really brilliant. They're getting a lot of things right. But this spot, as Bill talked about, doesn't really work that well. And why is that? There's a couple of details that are not so small. They're really big, that get in our way consistently when we think about creating great places and centers in strategic locations, which then can help us gracefully accommodate growth and multiply our benefits. And the two I want to mention are parking. It's the most important boring topic on earth. And getting our streets right. And that's what's happening right here, right? So we have a ton of parking, which has a suburban model. It assumes there's no transit anywhere close, and that you aren't in a walkable setting, and that you're not in a mixed-use setting. And then the fact that there's that much parking creates that reality, right? So if we want to create this walkable environment, we have to get the parking right. It's one of these topics that we have to elevate the awareness of our elected officials, our planning commissions. We just have to talk about it, that it's the most important boring topic on earth. Well, maybe not on earth, but in city planning. And then the streets, the definition of what we're trying to get and accomplish with the way we design our streets. And just for the sake of time, I won't get into it, but we have this basic paradigm where we're always thinking, how do we easily move cars with very little friction, efficiently, quickly, and we set that as our prevailing goal. That's not a bad prevailing goal, but when you're getting into the environment of a downtown, like we're trying to create here in Sandy, you have to change that goal, that paradigm. And it sounds a little bit, anyway, we have to think differently about the context of our parking and our streets when we're trying to create great places.
Laura?
Thank you. I really love the idea of thinking about the kind of place we want to be rather than the kind of place we want to avoid, because I think that helps drive all of our discussions. And I think one of the biggest barriers that I'm encountering as we're traveling the state is a little bit of nostalgia. I think a lot of Americans and Utahns just really romanticize that post-World War II American dream where everyone has a single family home and the kids are playing in the yard and there's a white picket fence and there's 2 cars in the driveway, and that is the epitome of success, right? That is where we all want to land. And I think the hard part is that in some ways we kind of want our cake and to eat it too, right? We want that experience, but we also want our kids to be able to live near us. We want housing that's more affordable. We want to be able to get from point A to point B without being in a traffic jam with all of our neighbors. and we don't really want our travel pattern or development patterns to change. And so it's like we've got this conflict within ourselves as Utahns that I think is going to be a really tough thing to work through. And, you know, growth decisions are hard. And I think we're, as a culture, as Utahns, we're going to need to be able to kind of take ourselves out of that white picket fence vision of what the ideal is and realize that we can have multiple different types of development patterns that create just as much community and are just as livable and just as enjoyable for people. And if we build in centers and implement the plans that we have, we can preserve those single-family neighborhoods as well. And so, I think there's this feeling of loss, I think, is what's really kind of rooting a lot of the pitchfork meetings is, you're taking away this sense of community that I have. And so, the solutions, I think we know what they are, right? I mean, Ted talked about community design. The earlier panel talked about redeveloping commercial areas and parking areas, center-based development that can preserve those single-family neighborhoods. ADUs can add housing and density to neighborhoods without really dramatically changing the scale or the feel of a neighborhood. Investing in transit and roads can help us move around more easily, but we have to get out of the mindset of I have to drive my car everywhere I go, and there's going to be one passenger in my car 90% of the time because I don't like to talk to strangers. I mean, we're just going to need to have some cultural shifts in our minds, and I think that's a tricky thing for people to overcome, and it's just going to take time, I'm afraid. But I see that as one of the biggest challenges.
Great. Are there structural or systematic issues kind of standing in the way that might need legislation to address? Whether it's the way cities collect revenue to help how they plan for their community, what kind of revenue they have to help facilitate that. Are there things standing in the way that might need to be changed structurally to help cities do more? Go ahead, Cameron. Yeah.
I get to be first for all of these. This is great. The answer to this question, I think, comes back to how Laura finished her comments, which is, what is the community that we are trying to be? I think when we look at what Utah has been over the last 100 years, we are in an enviable spot compared to the rest of the country. There's a reason why people want to move here. They want to move here because of access to the great outdoors. They want to move here because it's a family-friendly community. They want to move here because of the access to opportunities. And all of that didn't just happen by chance. It was collective effort by policymakers in the private sector for generations. So I think before you talk about major systemic changes, it's important to acknowledge how the system we've had has resulted in the quality of life that we have. Now, there are areas where communities are right at that tipping point on the balance that Nicole was talking about. I mean, Heber's sitting up here in front. Matt knows this very well. Like, the Heber Valley has been the fastest growing micropolitan area in the country for how many years now? Several, right? Heber Valley was once the undiscovered gem. I mean, how many of us stayed at the homestead growing up and found it to be a beautiful, quaint little area? It's not so quaint anymore, right? Because Heber Valley is exploding, and I attended a community meeting there over the summer where they were discussing how to bond for a second high school. And I was, quite honestly, Matt, I was flabbergasted when they showed the school enrollment numbers at Wasatch High today, because, again, growing up here, I played sports, I coached sports. I remember coaching against Wasatch High, and I was blown away that Wasatch High's enrollment numbers were comparable to Bingham's enrollment numbers. That didn't dawn on me until I was in that meeting that Wasatch High is a Bingham High. Because even being a local, Wasatch High was never a Bingham. Wasatch High was, a 3A small school in the Wasatch back. Well, those growth challenges mean, how do you get people around the Heber Valley? How do you have a sense of place on Main Street when you have truck traffic coming all the time? Like, these are the growth challenges that we didn't really have 20, 30 years ago that we now have, and the Heber Valley is a perfect example of it. So when I think about systems, there are a couple of things that come to mind. One, is just how we plan transportation. And the legislature several years ago, and the league supported this effort, spent an entire year reconsidering how UDOT prioritizes their state funds for transportation. It was SB 136, and there have been several bills that have built on that, but for the first time after SB 136, the State Transportation Commission no longer only looks at congestion and safety. So you take that Texas example that was given earlier. I don't know what the evaluation process is in Texas, but my hunch is it's predominantly, if not exclusively, safety and congestion. Hence, hey, let's build a 20-lane freeway. In Utah, because of SB 136, safety and congestion are still critical components, but now state law requires a consideration of local land use and economic development potential, so that when UDOT is programming those state transportation dollars, there's more coordination with what's happening at the local level. And we actually built off of that bill with SB 34 and House Bill 462, which then proactively requires cities to plan for moderate income housing to then be eligible for those state transportation dollars. So that was really the first systemic change, is trying to integrate all of these moving pieces in how the state funds transportation and how it connects with local land use plans and local land use visions for their communities. At a local level at City Hall, cities have not seen the same level of financial benefit that the state has over the last decade of unprecedented growth, because cities get exactly $0 of income tax. The state constitution requires that state income tax go, only the state can impose an income tax, and then the vast majority of those dollars go to education, higher ed and public ed, and then with the recent constitutional amendment, there are other uses that can go there. But income tax doesn't pay for infrastructure, income tax doesn't pay for cops, income tax doesn't pay for water. So again, all those nuts and bolts things that cities need, you've had this incredible growth in income tax, but local governments don't see that. Local governments instead are reliant on property tax, sales tax, and other user fees. On the property tax side, thankfully we're not California. But Utah does have two restraints that do complicate things for local government. One is truth in taxation, which makes it difficult for local governments to raise property taxes. But second is the fact that state law already subsidizes housing. Because under state law, a commercial property is assessed at its 100% value, whereas residential properties are only assessed at 55% value. So you've got those two artificial restraints on housing with property tax for local governments, and cities make up about 15% of your average property tax bill in Utah. Then cities get sales tax, cities get some motor fuel tax, and cities get some other user fees. So real quickly on the sales tax piece, cities get a 50% point of sale and 50% based on population. And that's really been the only real area of growth that local governments have seen over the last decade. We did make some changes on how cities can incentivize sales tax last year. But that sales tax piece is really important for how cities pay for infrastructure, because without that, we would not have been able to keep up with the growth over the last few years. The motor fuel tax, because of the shift in preferences, you heard Clark Ivory talk about driving an electric car. There are a lot of us who drive electric cars or hybrid cars or using transit, all of which are not contributing to that motor fuel fund, which then means, again, cities are only able to use motor fuel tax revenues to cover about 60% of their average transportation costs. So again, where does the money come from to pay for those transportation costs? It has to come from somewhere else, sales tax and property tax. And then you have user fees. So there was a discussion earlier about impact fees. Well, impact fees here are restrained. You have to maintain your level of service, and they can only be used on certain things. So again, you have these restraints on how local governments can use these revenue sources while we're trying to build all this infrastructure, maintain all this infrastructure, provide all the services that residents rely on. So it does put city leaders at City Hall in a really tough position.
Ted, looks like you want to say something. I'll come back to you, Nicole.
The question of structural changes, one thing, just building off of what Cam said, it hits me first as we have just put in place a number of structural changes. New requirements for cities in their planning that I think strike a really good balance between giving them the ability to make their decisions within a framework. 462 House Bill 462 is one of those. The UDOT prioritization model change, transportation reinvestment zones, housing transportation reinvestment zones, these funding mechanisms that communities can take advantage of. These are new, right? And so I think we should lean in together and test drive what we've already been putting in place, structural changes, really demonstrate that they work, or demonstrate that through real effort that there may still be tweaks. But I think it's a great time for us to acknowledge that we don't necessarily need to be looking at the next set of solutions, because we've just put in place some things that we really need to test out. But not trying to dodge the question too much, I do think that the question of home ownership and multifamily needs to be tackled. We used to have more condominiums on the marketplace, and we all know that has dried up. That's not my area of expertise, but I think that that's a legislative arena that should be tackled.
Nicole?
I was just going to add that I agree. I think that we in Utah enjoy this very cohesive methodology by which we move forward in these decisions, and many of those have been made and have left us with a good place to implement some of those hundreds of things that Clark Ivory talked about. I think many of those hundreds can be accomplished right now with the efforts of all of our partners here. The other thing that I think the state has done recently that I happen to be aware of from another hat that I wear is encourage public-private partnerships in a more robust way. And that doesn't necessarily mean the old style of public-private partnerships like toll road type things, but all kinds of public-private partnerships in all areas across the state. And as you heard Laura mention, some of the things that are really difficult to tackle in this arena happen in some of our more rural and underpopulated or less populated areas. And this encouragement of public-private partnerships, I think it makes us smarter, it makes us stronger, and it makes us more capable. And I think that the Ivory Foundation and our MPOs, many of the people, the state level things that Laura's doing, many of the people we engage with across the spectrum here, as we utilize those tools, we have this capability in Utah to be flexible in those. Flexible because our legislature has allowed us to be flexible. Flexible because of the structure of the land use and planning opportunities that we have. And that does make us different among our sister states. It is something that we need to value, recognize, and maintain, because it makes us different. And as we look at things that might need to change systemically, if we continue down a path where we feel like maybe we need to dial things down, tighten things down, I would just submit that caution be utilized there, because one of the things that makes us great and unique is that ability to be really flexible and to be really enterprising and to do things in a different way. And I think we are unique in that from a legislative perspective.
Laura?
Thanks. Well, first of all, we have such smart people in our state. I feel like we are going to succeed in this because it's the Utah way. We work together, we collaborate, but also, we've heard so many great ideas from Cameron, Nicole, and Ted, and then also the panelists earlier of things that we could do. There are lots of ideas out there, and I think we have the culture and the community to bring us together and to work through those kinds of things. So I feel like the future is bright. I have a couple of additional ideas that are not necessarily things that I think we should do, but they are areas that we ought to explore, other places that we could look at. Some of those are making more strategic investments in active transportation, in open space. Cameron talked about increasing our funding in public transportation. I think those are all great things that we could do. There are a lot of policy levers that we could pull as well. We could make our general plans more binding, for example, rather than just making it just an advisory document. We could look at water pricing to encourage conservation. We could look at free fare transit. How about congestion pricing to discourage everyone from driving their cars during certain times of day. We could change our policy around short-term rentals. There are lots of different tools and opportunities that we could explore. I don't know what all the right combination will be for Utah. And going back to my earlier comment about what happens on the Wasatch Front versus what happens in rural Utah, and Cameron's gonna be proud of me when I say this, but no one size fits all. We need nuanced solutions that address the issues in different places, and so I think there's great opportunity, but we have a lot of hard work to do.
We've got about 10 minutes left, but I wanted to end with a question about housing affordability. I'm biased because I'm submerged in the crazy housing market stuff every single day. But I just wanted to pose the question, the very general question, can we actually plan our way out of this Utah housing affordability crisis? Or is there more that needs to happen from other sides, from the private side, from other angles? Let's start with you again, Cameron. This will be our last. So if you want to add anything else, this is your chance.
Perfect. Thank you, Katie. I mentioned before that you'd asked $1 billion question. Now you're asking the generational question, because ultimately future generations of Utahns are going to be the beneficiaries of whatever we do in the next few years. So your question is, can we plan our way to address housing affordability? And I want to make sure we're clear on terminology here, because there's housing affordability and there's affordable housing. And affordable housing has a different legal definition, even though they're constantly merged in the conversation. Affordable housing is housing for low-income individuals, which, generally speaking, the market does not provide on its own. There will always need to be some sort of intervention, whether it's nonprofits, government, or whatever, in order to make sure that housing units are provided for, or built and preserved for low-income Utahns. Housing affordability is the broader umbrella piece. The broader umbrella piece about the fact that housing costs have gone up exponentially faster than wages have. And so again, this is not unique to Utah, it's happening all over the country, but you have housing affordability and a housing gap. So it's a supply issue, but there are a lot more components to it. City leaders often get frustrated, feeling like they get blamed for the housing affordability challenges. So let's just think about all the different inputs that go into housing. There's the labor shortage in the construction industry. In fact, the Gardner Policy Institute did a report that showed that there were fewer construction workers in Utah at the peak of the housing gap than there were a decade earlier before the recession. So, and keep in mind all of the competition for those jobs, such as big public works projects like the Salt Lake International Airport rebuild and others. So labor shortage, cities have no control over the labor shortage. The cost of land has increased exponentially. Cities have no influence over that. The supply chain issues and cost of materials. Again, I think if we could solve supply chain issues at City Hall, we would, but we can't. So that's outside of our control. Ditto with interest rates, inflation. So all of these pressure points on housing are outside of the control of the local government. So what do we control? Well, cities control regulation, they control planning, zoning, fees. So that's often where the legislature will default. Like, we have to keep tackling this, we have to keep tackling this. Well, generally speaking, the fees that people pay for housing here are much, much lower than what was given in California. And you actually get a service for those fees. You get the connection to the sewer system, which every future homeowner wants. So there's constantly the pressure to reduce impact fees or other sorts of development fees. Will that in and of itself result in housing affordability? I think the answer is unclear on that one. You look at planning and zoning and how cities plan for housing. Well, density can help, but density in and of itself doesn't equate to affordability either. So to me, the bigger question to solve is, how do we plan for growth in a responsible way? And cities absolutely are at the forefront of that. Because whether it's coordinating with regional bodies like Wasatch Front, state leaders, the private sector, we have to plan to accommodate a new city of Murray every year. And the reason I brought up Murray and I brought up Heber is because the survey data shows us that Utahns are more frustrated with growth today than they've ever been before. There's more frustration about the direction than there's ever been. And that's in part because in Wasatch County, in addition to the school bond, you had a bunch of local governments that were looking to raise property taxes to pay for infrastructure, and they see this mass influx and former fields are turning into subdivisions, and you're changing our quality of life. Now, in the case of Murray, the Jordan River Parkway has actually helped my dad and some of his neighbors be less frustrated with growth because they can see the amenity that comes with it. So to me, the role of the city is to plan for growth, make sure those quality of life amenities are there. And as part of planning for growth, there are things that the city can do to plan for housing affordability. You can plan for a variety of housing types, which we're doing at record levels with townhomes and duplexes, and condos and apartments. And you plan for those in a strategic way so that it fits systemically and fits within centers and fits within the overall plans for the community. So that is one of the levers that local governments can pull. It's a lever that the state government can also pull, but thus far, unlike California, we've had more of a collaborative relationship between the state and locals trying to meet those objectives. But let's not oversell the ability of planning and zoning to address all of those other market factors that are outside of our control. So I think the answer is a qualified yes.
Thank you. I've had the good fortune of sitting on the Olin Walker Housing Trust Fund loan board for probably 12 years now, maybe 13 years. So I've seen a lot of applications come in that fit the prior definition that Cam mentioned, the affordable housing definition. And I'll talk about that for just a minute. I have seen in this state, beginning a lot with the Olin Walker Housing Trust Fund, but morphing into so many things, strive and be successful in that affordable housing arena. And one of the things you may not be aware of is the remarkable strides that former Senate President Niederhauser has made with regards to that sector of our housing need, in particular at very low income housing, and just the immense amount of effort and heavy lift that he and his team and the state have put forward with regards to that really will be impactful and extremely helpful to Utah. And I believe in that effort, and I see it making a difference. Along with the other things, many of the things the state has done at that level to make and plan for the successes in that low to moderate and affordable housing array. When you get to housing affordability and that discussion, I agree wholeheartely with Cameron. What that is a function of a whole list of market forces, some of which the municipalities control, many of which are not controlled by the municipalities. But when it comes to the term planning, if you mean planning overall, holistically, I think the answer is yes. If you mean planning specific to planning at the local level, I also think the answer is yes. I think we do have the capability, as Cameron mentioned, to wisely and on a micro level plan for housing affordability in ways that bring balance to a community. And I think a sustainable community must have that balance, and that is in a different range of housing types. And I think that's where we'll really see some acceleration, and have seen, as Cameron mentioned, thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of entitled and not yet permitted or not yet pulled on permits units across this valley and across the Wasatch Front in particular. And that will make a difference. And I think that demonstrates the level of ability we have there.
Ted?
I agree with Nicole and Cam. I think that we can all agree that housing abundance and having great supply match our demand can help tremendously. I think one of the key lessons from California has been the failure to do that, to enable housing abundance. And you know, Bill Fulton talked about this all too common San Francisco approach to housing of we will only allow housing if it is income restricted. Income restricted housing is needed. We need that. But we need it to meet broad housing needs to take the pressure off so that those, middle income households are not bidding against the, other residents for the naturally affordable housing, right? So we've got to have abundance across the entire ladder, and I think that's one of the key lessons from California. I'm going to wrap up. I know we're behind. I see Steve or Craig standing up. I just want to note that one of the things that's emerged over the last couple of years in Utah, which I love, is a real conversation about where housing occurs. Housing abundance near transit, in centers. What has not occurred hardly at all in Utah, nor in most places, I think, is where do the jobs occur? And are the jobs in places that can be easily accessed by by those that live in workforce housing? Are the jobs near transit? Are the jobs in centers? Can people live without a second car? So if we're trying to tackle what Chris and Alan talked about of reducing both housing plus transportation together, we have to also think about where jobs go and not just where housing goes.
Great, and we'll end with Laura.
I'll be super fast, especially because housing is really not my area of expertise. But there's a couple of really interesting ideas I've heard about recently that I wanted to share. I just met a guy whose son just took out a 50-year mortgage. And at first I was like, oh my gosh, that's insane. But the idea is, when you're a first-time home buyer, you're young, you don't have a lot of money, you can have a really affordable payment, and then you refinance it later as you have more income. And a home does last for a long time, and so you can finance over the lifespan of the home. But anyways, I thought that was interesting. Another idea that I heard about recently was taking the idea of like the My 29 college savings plan, but making a version of it just for first-time home buyers to be able to save tax-free dollars to help them put towards their first purchase, which I thought was a really interesting idea. So, thanks.
Great. We'd like to wrap up to leave time for audience questions. I think Craig's going to come up and moderate that. Great. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. So Chris and Bill are still in the room. You've been waiting for all this time to make your comment or ask a question. We'll try to limit the responses so there is time for a good interaction here with the group. So who'd like to start us out? Do you have a reaction, a comment, a question for our panel and others to respond to? Yes.
I've heard it both ways. So I was just wondering if someone on the panel or in the past could confirm whether or not, in fact, the bulk of our state's growth is internal. When the Utah Housing Gap from the Salt Lake Chamber came and spoke at a luncheon, they had the stats from 2020. So it was nice to hear an update of the gap shortage. But it was from them that I learned the bulk of our growth was like 60-40-ish, mostly internal. But at a more recent meeting that I pulled, I heard someone from the state level say that it wasn't quite that. So I was just wondering if someone could in fact confirm that.
Yeah, I can address that. So Craig and I have been doing a lot of different meetings with a woman named Mallory Bateman from the Kempsey Gardner Policy Institute that produces the state's population projections. And historically, that has been the case, that our own natural increase has been the bulk of our growth. That has shifted in the last decade, and even more so pronouncedly in the last year. So we are projected long-term to see more people moving in than our own natural increase. That is because our fertility rate is declining a little bit, so we're having fewer babies here in Utah, and because what makes Utah great makes people want to join us, and so that is a shift. It's still, approximately 50-50 or so, but that gap will widen as we go on. Yeah.
Thank you. Next.
Thank you, everyone. As long-range planning manager for Sandy City, Your criticisms are noted and largely agreed with. I would like to point out that 2 of our panelists were professors of mine, so any failure at the practical level. No, my question is around incrementalism. What you don't see is what we're trying to do. On nearly a daily basis, I'm looking at projects, whether they're city projects or private developers bringing in projects, and I'm saying that doesn't meet our plan, but it may be 70%, 80% of where we want to go. We have brought in hundreds of residential units and thousands of jobs in the last couple of years, or within a half-mile radius of our transit stations in this area. And the city has been very involved in buying properties, putting out RFPs to control projects. The city's been very involved in bringing in infrastructure into this area. But again, whether it's the Public Works Department or the Economic Development Department or a private developer, at what level should we accept something less than what is desirable and in the name of progress and hopefully getting closer with each iteration and so forth?
Ted.
Well, I think that, Jake, that's a really great question. I vacillate myself on that. I don't think that we can let perfection be the enemy of good generally. And I think that we can reassess what success is every few years. We get things rolling, get things started, demonstrate that there's a market for, urban living in Sandy, good projects, and then as that momentum grows, then raise the bar. I think that that's a reasonable approach generally when we think about cities and urbanism, that it's an organism and it changes over time. It's nice if we can put projects in such a way that we are thinking about evolution over time. We organize parking in a way that it can be more easily redeveloped and things like that.
I'll be really, really fast. One thing that I would say to get right the first time is your street network. Once that's in place, it's there forever. Buildings come and go, land uses come and go, but streets, even in medieval towns, are in the places where they used to be.
Yeah, I was just going to add that I have a few things that I would say that you absolutely have to get right at first, just stemming from some very steep redevelopment experiences in my life. And so I think street network is a great one, but I also would really caution any kind of, I just would be careful about things like longevity of building and aesthetic, and also sustainability. And I mean that in the green sense, but also in the longer, broader vision of green sense. There are things that I just think we can't move on when we're talking about a generational thing that's going into the ground. And that's just because I've had to redevelop the things that we didn't do that on before.
So this is a question for Dr. Nelson or Mayor Fulton more than anybody else up there, I guess. But in my role as the chair of the Wasatch Front Regional Council this past 2 years, I've had the opportunity to interact with some folks from California, and we had an interesting visit this summer from the Metropolitan Planning Organization in Sacramento, SAG they call it. And I had the opportunity actually to show them parts of my city in Mill Creek and also in South Salt Lake, our neighbor, with some of the things that we're doing along the tracks line, light rail line through those two communities. What they remarked about, and this is for all of us to know, and I'll get to bore you more about this afternoon, but they remarked to us, to Mayor Wood in South Salt Lake and me, about the fact that Utah seemed to be a lot more intentional about addressing the growth challenges that we face than they've seen in their community particularly. And then the other thing that they actually asked us, they looked at some of the buildings that are going up around there, and what we're seeing in that area of our of the Salt Lake Valley really is, quite a few of these podium-style 6, 7-story multifamily projects going up. And they ask us, how do you get that stuff built? How can you get this much done in this short a period of time? And so their comment really was, California may be doing things, kind of like the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. The state legislature seems to be addressing statewide zoning on one hand, but then the regulatory climate in California with respect to the hurdles and the red tape that you have to do to build anything, we're frustrating them in terms of their ability to meet the growth challenges. So what can you say about that, and is that a piece of this? We haven't talked about that, but what about the different regulatory climate between California and Utah?
I'm like Chris, I don't know how to do this. There are a couple of things in California that create obstacles. One is the omnipresent threat of an initiative or referendum. Anything that is a legislative act can go on the ballot, and the courts in California have ruled that a zone change is a legislative act, so any zone change theoretically can go on the ballot. The other is easy access to the courts by citizen groups and neighborhood groups, especially through the environmental review law in California, the mini NEPA that California has, the California Environmental Quality Act. That is probably the biggest time obstacle CEQA is. It's unpredictable and slows things down. Most of the state legislation it's been easier for the state to create ministerial end runs around CEQA than to reform it. And so they've sort of given up trying to reform this environmental review law and instead have punched holes in it. But that is a major obstacle that most other states don't have, even other states that have mini NEPAs, because it applies to basically, it applies to any government action, and approval of a permit is regarded as a government action. So it's not like NEPA, which is just about public projects. Any private project probably has to go through an environmental review process. And so that's why the incentive to end run it with ministerial is so high.
So California has one of the best housing element requirements in the country. You have to prepare a housing element to your comprehensive plan. It is rigorous, it has to be reviewed and approved by the state. I've had students of mine go to California and prepare these things and email me in tears with all the rigor that's required. But even more tearful is they're not implemented. Except that a couple years ago, the legislatures put in a clause, and I don't know which bill it was, that basically told the Attorney General to sue local governments that didn't implement their state-approved housing element. And that is beginning to take hold, because no city council member wants to be sued by the state in state court. And there are penalties involved in this too. So I think that's an interesting potential sea change in opening up housing markets in California.
I think I need to make an editorial comment myself on this one. I used to work for Flying J Corporation in permitting. We literally would have had to have a public vote to build a travel center in Dixon, California. The company owned the land and couldn't get a truck stop built there without a public vote. Remember, in Utah, Sevier County, the citizens of Sevier County passed a referendum that would have made the citizens the land use authority for the administrative decision of having a conditional use on a coal-fired power plant. I mean, it didn't get anywhere, but that's why Laura's efforts to involve the state, the population, in a statewide conversation on growth is essential, so that as we try to make changes and improve how we do it, we don't get too far ahead of the public, which has equal legislative power to the legislature, for what it's worth. Yes, sir.
Just appreciate the conversation, and obviously the audience today is probably a group of people who are nodding in the affirmative as to we agree with what's being shared. I guess my question, and particular to you, Mayor Fulton, is aside from Twitter trolling, how do you engage in a productive conversation about this topic with your elected officials and your community at large? Because to this point, at least in the community that I serve in, it has become so divisive, and the NIMBYism conversation in all respects overwhelms any other piece of the conversation.
Well, the Twitter trolling is surprisingly effective in influencing how people in Sacramento view the situation. I don't think that I would say two things. At the local level, if there is a YIMBY group that actually shows up, right, and testifies in favor of a project, then that makes a difference because there's a counterweight in front of the council, right? If you want to do the right thing, you've got some cover. I will say, YIMBY California, the NIMBYs have accused YIMBY California of being backed by being financially backed by developers, and they're not. They're financially backed by tech. But more important is the role that the YIMBY movement has played in Sacramento. They've been very effective in promoting the housing, what we in California call the housing production laws. And the Twitter trolling is kind of part of that, right? It doesn't change anybody's mind in Atherton or somewhere like that, which is the most expensive suburb in Silicon Valley. But it does highlight some of the short-sightedness of the NIMBYs to the advantage of the YIMBYs in Sacramento. So it's mostly targeted at the legislature. It's not targeted at the local level. And then of course the locals do have to respond to the legislative action.
So I have a little bit of I guess maybe a follow-up question on that at the local level. So Utah, we're rugged individualists, we value our freedom, and yet all of the stuff we talk about here tends to at least potentially be viewed as impairing that. So when we talk about property rights, and when we have mandatory requirements, and when we talk about landscaping to save water, but that seems like it's against my ability to use my land how I want, or increased density seems to somehow hurt my neighborhood. What I'm trying to get at is we come up with great plans, we have general plans, and we say this is what we want to do and this is how we're going to get there, but when it's time to approve it, how do you think that the local officials stand behind the general plan and actually vote in favor of it in the face of this kind of attitude that we have in Utah about who we are?
Well, you're right. Obviously, a regulatory requirement to have single-family zoning and a regulatory requirement to have maximum parking requirements is consistent with the state's property rights orientation, right? I think I run into this issue in Texas where the Republican legislators say, well, the problem with housing is that there's too much regulation. And I say, okay, we'll get rid of zoning and get rid of parking requirements. And then they look at me, they laugh at me. Because there's a difference between, there's a difference between my property rights and your property rights, right? So I think you have to frame it not as pro-property rights or anti-property rights. You have to frame it as a balance of different people's rights, right? Shouldn't I have the right to build what I want? And if the market, as Chris says, if the market wants denser housing, shouldn't I be allowed to build that? Why should zoning restrain me from doing that? So it's a question of whose property rights, how you're going to balance different individuals' property rights. It's not a question of whether somebody has property rights or somebody doesn't, because most of the standard land use regulation constrains property rights pretty extremely, even in Utah.
One of the big challenges our local community faces is tax deficit from the property tax received to the infrastructure requirements for streets and roads, especially for replacement. Our community is also experiencing a pretty big explosion in growth as well from subdivisions, and so we anticipate that in a decade or 2 decades there'll be a challenge where replacement of those streets and roads will come due, but we don't have the property taxes to pay for it. Watching St. George go through a failure to increase taxes recently has kind of prompted us to say, what kind of local tools can local governments use to prepare for that eventuality coming down the road, whether that comes into the form of development agreements or local ordinances that help us now prepare for that eventuality.
I thought Cameron would just grab the mic in a hurry on that.
I'm not sure I have a good answer for that, except for I think it is real and it is a reality. One of the things that we have chosen to do in West Valley that I don't know, I feel like has helped a little bit with the conversation overall is that we do truth in taxation every year. We hold the truth in taxation hearing, we do the noticing, we typically recover the judgment levy. So, you know, in our case, that's $60,000 or $70,000 a year. And we do that routinely so that our residents recognize that that is the tool that we have and that we're going to review that every year. I think that has helped us a little bit as we have had a couple of years where we've had to increase tax. I do think the discussion of what it really takes to sustain development and to also, of course, provide the services that come with that, including the long-term care and look on those very important infrastructure pieces is something we will have to face, particularly because we are rich in infrastructure here in Utah. I think that we, as we look around and recognize how much we have invested in that already, the exponential increase on the back end to take care of that and replace it grows daily. So not a very satisfying answer, I recognize, but one thing to try is truth in taxation every year. We've been doing that for maybe 10 or 12 years now, and it's been productive, I think.
The St. George example was a fascinating one to watch, and there were several communities around the state that did not go through with truth and taxation because of the hearings. That said, there were 51 cities that had truth and taxation hearings this year, and more than 40 of them still went through with some type of property tax increase. It may not have been the full amount initially proposed, but still went through with some. And this is the tough conversation that elected officials have every day with residents, which is, how are we going to pay for the services and the infrastructure that you need? How are we balancing property rights? I often get asked, like, why do cities care so much about zoning? And to me, the reason we care about zoning is because zoning and the planning that prefaces the zoning is all about building that sense of community. And without that sense of community and without the sustainability and the balance in your community and the ability to pay for services and pay for infrastructure, not to get apocalyptic, but you find yourself waking up one morning to what San Francisco has become and say, well, how did we get here, right? So how do we make sure we're sustainable long term? And having that real and authentic conversation with residents is very, very tough to do. And I have the great privilege of representing over 1,400 mayors and council members across the state who are having those conversations in some form or fashion every day. So my recommendation to your city and just to cities in general is have that ongoing dialogue with your public about the fact that infrastructure is not free and what residents rely on requires prudent use of taxpayer dollars, and be clear with them over an extended period of time so that they feel like they're partners in that budgeting effort.
Okay, I would just quickly echo that. I had an experience recently in West Valley City that was actually really inspiring, and I'll leave you with this comment, and it was exactly to this issue. We had a gentleman come who was first generation here in the country and is from Honduras. And this was about 6 weeks ago. And he came to our public comment period only to give public comment. And his comment went a little bit like this. I'm gonna slaughter it, but his comment was, I just wanted to come and thank you for all of the things that I see around me that I know that you're responsible for, that I pay for as I pay my taxes. And his expression of that came in the form of where he had come from, where he said, in my country, I paid taxes before, but never had anything come on the back end. And it was quite an inspiring and kind of a once in a lifetime experience to have someone who had had that experience be in our public meeting and share that with us. But it was a delight to us and to our council, and I think that it's real, and it's real not just in our country, but here in particular in Utah. We're very mindful, I think, of public dollars, but also recognize the value of that. And it was just it was a great thing and left me, feeling good. So I thought I'd share that with you.
Question. We hear a lot about the housing affordability crisis. And as a consequence of that discussion, local government in particular gets pressure to authorize greater density. But that density always comes in the form of a rental product. And so my question is, how does increased housing density, increased apartments help solve our housing crisis if none of those renters are getting equity in the unit they occupy? And what can we do to give people who are not in the market today, in terms of ownership, an opportunity to get into the market so that they own something where they will gain equity over time?
So where's Clark Ivory when we need him? Clark has several hundred or thousand rental apartment units, and what he does, and he tells the renters, I'm setting aside a certain amount of money per month, your money, into an account for you for the time when you want to buy a home. Well, he says one of my homes, of course. But he's got a good inventory. So he does it voluntarily on his own, and people renting his properties understand that. That's rare. I wish there was more of that. The 529 idea, was that your idea? That was a great idea. We should innovate more tax laws this way. But otherwise, I know that in several large metropolitan areas, Denver, Phoenix, and others, the barriers to condominium development are enormous. For example, just 3 weeks ago in Arizona, a court ruled that a multi-family home developer is responsible for defects 8 years after the deal closes. That really kiboshes condominium development, unless you wait 8 years and then you can do the conversion. In Denver or Colorado, it's a 5-year window. So we have these odd barriers around the country. I don't know Utah, but so these are just some of my initial thoughts about this very wise question.
Utah actually addressed the condo defect law a couple of years ago, but one of the biggest challenges we face here is just the financing. And so I would love to hear from our private sector partners how to answer Lynn's question, because as I've talked to mayors and council members around the state, and I've just posed to them the question, do you think the opposition from the residents would be as great to this 6-story building if there were owner-occupied units, if there were condos instead of apartments? And generally the response back I get from folks is, no, the opposition would be much less if we knew that there were going to be some owner-occupied units, because the owner-occupied unit comes rightly or wrongly with the perception of these folks are going to be around in our community for a while, be invested in the community, and it lessens that opposition. So to me, this is a perfect example of how the private sector and the public sector need to work together to solve that issue, which in turn helps to tackle the overall issue. That's our time to be done, right?
Thank you to the panel. Just a laundry list of house cleaning items. First of all, thanks to the realtors. The reason we list them as a sponsor is that they allow us to use this facility without charge each year, and it makes a big difference. So I want to particularly single them out for thanks. And while I'm talking to realtors, be sure you initial your signature again during lunch. The PowerPoints are online, and the materials that were part of the conversation will be online, we hope, by tomorrow. Also want to mention, of course, we heard of Bill Fulton's new book, Place and Prosperity, How Cities Help Us Connect and Innovate. We had expected Weller Bookstore to be here to sell some of those books today, and unfortunately, the books didn't arrive. But Ms. Weller called me and talked to me this morning, and she will have a group of those at Weller Bookstore over the weekend. So please consider Weller's as a place to pick up your copy of that book. And they're located, of course, in Trolley Square here in Salt Lake City. The Nelson Festschrift book, the big, thick white one, is free. Please be sure to take your copy as you find it convenient during the day. I also wanted to mention another thing that the Utah Land Use Institute's involved in. We heard a little about the statewide conversation on growth, and Laura mentioned that. Part of that are workshops we're holding for local officials, and we want you to join us at those workshops if you're available. They are coming up quick. Next Thursday will be in Colville, and that's for Summit, Wasatch, Morgan, and part of the valley side of Weber County. We're gathering in Colville at 4 o'clock on the 3rd. That's a Thursday. We're gathering in Provo at 4 o'clock on the 7th. That's the following Monday. And that's at the Utah Valley Convention Center. And then on the 10th, that's a Thursday, we'll be in Taylorsville at the Mid-Valley Events Center. And the goal is to bring all the elected officials we can get in the room, all the city council members and planning commissioners, some builders, some realtors, of course the planners that want to support this conversation, and then turn the conversation back. This is where, as Laura mentioned, Mallory Bateman from the Gardner Institute has come and talked about growth numbers for that specific area. Then we invite Envision Utah to just start the conversation, and then we turn it around and turn it over to the circular table where each person is having dinner, and the people at that table then explain what is it that the cities are facing, what are the locals facing in terms of challenges with growth, and how can state agencies and the legislatures help? And we gather that information, we have a real-time conversation, we make notes and report back, and we're trying to build a pattern, some kind of an agenda for the Governor's Office of Planning and Budget, for Envision Utah, for the Utah Land Use Institute. We've been given a grant to go out and do training. So right now it looks like we want to do a training on how to conduct an appeal authority, how to write an appeals ordinance, how to do transferable development rights. From our session yesterday, there may be training we can do, not training isn't probably not the right word, but communicating a process on water for the grassroots, I guess maybe they're called the grass tops. That is, the elected officials and the planning commissioners are actually on the front lines. So if you'd like to join with us and participate in helping that particular group catch a vision of what we're talking about, those workshops are available utahlanduse.org on the workshops tab. That's the full information. The critical thing is that those who come must RSVP and let us know, because we're going to buy dinner. So we want to make sure we know how much dinner to provide. The Land Use Institute also is available to do 3 and 4 hour planning commission type training using the book we published called Ground Rules. We're doing that in St. George on the 16th of November, and we're available to go out to different communities and do that as you wish. Okay, 2 more items. We are going to have breakout sessions this afternoon. Not breakup, breakout. So I need to get a sense of the group so I know which one of these sessions to hold in the big room and which ones to hold in the smaller room. So if you would please, by show of hands, tell me which of the sessions you intend to attend, that'll greatly help our planning. So at 1:30, we have a legislative efforts to promote housing affordability, and we have Christina Oliver from the Housing and Community Development Department that'll join Representative Waldrop and Mayor Silvestrini. We also have an opportunity for another hour conversation with our celebrity guest here, Bill, and have a just a sense of the ongoing things we can learn as we chat with somebody with that kind of experience and background. So how many will be planning to attend the Legislative Housing Workshop? And how many the conversation with Bill? Okay, perfect. We want it to be a conversation, so that's good. The next one is innovation in housing. And this is where the Ivory Institute will come and explain what they have found throughout the nation as they've conducted several years of Ivory Awards. They'll be here to explain and show some of the innovative things they really thought had some star power. And the other option is the role of PID financing, this particular type of financing that the development community is suggesting as a ways to pay for infrastructure. So how many would be attending the Ivory Innovations session? And how many on PID financing? Okay. Last one. So we have a great conversation going about public over-participation. Are we doing, because of the way we structure our land use process, are we empowering the public too much on administrative issues? Should we roll that back and maybe do some things to make administrative issues easier to handle without a lot of public input, or not? How do you discuss that balance? And that's Paul Allred, Wilf Summercorn, Wade Budge. On the other hand, we have 3 prominent builders that will come and just talk about what is going on in the housing market. How are they responding and what are they planning for the next few months? So how many would like to attend the public over participation session? And the home building, state of the builders? Okay, that one looks like it's a little closer. So let me then go back and tell you how this will work. So the conversation with Bill Felton will be in the Brighton room across the foyer. And the new financing methods for the second hour will be in the Brighton room across the foyer. And then we will go also in the Brighton room with public over participation. The other 3 sessions will be here in the big room. Okay, one more thing. These are your luncheon choices. So you'll know, I want this one, and you can beeline for it.